Following the capture and looting of Rome by the armies of Charles the Holy Roman Emperor in 1527, Florence was declared a republic. However, the city came under siege in October 1529 before it finally fell in August 1530. In a new agreement between Pope Clement VII and Charles, the Medici family was once more returned to power in the city. Having worked for the defense of the Florence, it is thought that Michelangelo had a profound love of the city rather than a belief in any religious political cause. By designing fortifications, Michelangelo was re-employed by Pope Clement, who gave him a new contract to recommence work on the tomb of Pope Julius II. Leda and the Swan is believed to be a lost tempera painting from 1529, which was probably deliberately destroyed. The image depicted Zeus, the king of the gods, seducing Leda whilst in the form of a swan. The work was commissioned in 1529 by Alfonso d'Este for his Palazzo in Ferrara and taken to France for the royal collection in 1532. The painting was recorded as being in Fontainebleau in 1536. Michelangelo cartoon for the work, given to his assistant Antonio Mini, who used it for several copies for French patrons before his death in 1533, survived for over a century. This composition is known from many copies, including an ambitious engraving by Cornelis Boss, circa 1563. The marble sculpture by Bartolomeo Ammanati in the Bargello, Florence, 2 copies by the young Rubens on his Italian voyage, and the painting after Michelangelo circa 1530 in the National Gallery, London. Michelangelo composition is reported to have had mannerist tendencies of elongation and a twisted pose that was popular at the time. Apollo David, believed to depict the mythological god of the sun Apollo or the biblical character David. This unfinished sculpture dates from 1530 and is housed in the Bargello Museum in Florence. The statue had been commissioned for the private palace of Baccio Valori when the fierce governor was imposed on Florence by Clement VII after recovery of the city from a protracted siege. Work on the sculpture stopped shortly after Alessandro de' Medici was made duke and Michelangelo was forced to flee the city. The sculpture then entered the collection of Duke Cosimo I. It was placed in his private quarters, along with a Bacchus of Baccio Bandinelli, a work of Andrea Sansovino, and an old Ganymede that had been restored by Benvenuto Cellini. Hallmarks of Michelangelo style and methods exist on the unfinished work that support the attribution, though some still question its authenticity. According to Vasari, the sculpture depicts Apollo in the act of taking an arrow from a quiver. In the inventory of Cosimo I of 1553, however, it is identified as the biblical David. Art critics therefore identify the sculpture as one or the other, or by listing a hyphenated title, Apollo David. In 1534, Michelangelo headed to Rome, where he would live out the rest of his days. He sent many letters from Rome to family members, many relating to the marriage of a nephew and the preservation of the family name. His father and brother had recently passed, and Michelangelo reveals himself as someone becoming increasingly concerned about his own mortality. At the age of 57, Michelangelo would establish the first of 3 close friendships. Tommaso dei Cavalieri was a 23-year-old Italian nobleman who is thought to have been the artist's young lover and a lifelong friend. However, some historians, Gilbert included, point out that Michelangelo's sexuality cannot be confirmed, and the fact that he had no heir suggests that in Tommaso, the light of our century, paragon of all the world, as the artist once described him, Michelangelo might have been seeking an adopted son. The belief that Michelangelo was homosexual is nevertheless reinforced by the knowledge that he penned over 300 poems and 75 sonnets, some so homoerotic in nature that his grandnephew, upon publishing these as a collection in 1623, changed the gender pronouns to disguise their original context. In Rome, Michelangelo turned to fresco panting once more, this time in the services of Pope Paul III. In 1534 he found himself again at the site of one of his greatest triumphs, painting a grand and dynamic salvation narrative for the altar wall in the Sistine Chapel. It would take him 7 years to complete. The Last Judgment, with its theme of Jesus' second coming, was part of the grand narrative of Roman Catholic teaching. Michelangelo fresco represented an attempt on the part of the Pope to oppose the Protestant Reformation in what was known as the Counter-Reformation or Catholic Reformation, which was sweeping Northern Europe and had challenged the authority of the Catholic Church. Michelangelo still took subtle liberties with the traditional telling of the biblical story, such as the representation of a beardless Christ, and by omitting altogether his throne and the attendant wingless angels. The Last Judgment. This landmark fresco was executed on the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel from 1536 to 1541, 25 years after Michelangelo had finished the Sistine Chapel ceiling decorations. The fresco depicts the second coming of Christ and God's final judgment of humanity. The souls of humans rise and descend to their fates, as judged by Christ surrounded by prominent saints, including Saints Catherine of Alexandria, Peter, Florence, Bartholomew, Paul, Sebastian, John the Baptist, and others. Michelangelo accepted the commission from Pope Clement VII, with the original subject of the mural being the resurrection of Christ. However, following the Pope's death, his successor, Pope Paul III, felt that the Last Judgment was a more fitting subject for 1530s Rome and the judgmental impulses of the Counter-Reformation. Michelangelo's handling of the subject was innovative and unconventional. Whereas traditional medieval depictions of the Last Judgment represented figures dressed according to their social positions, the artist created a new standard, portraying figures equal in status due to their nudity, literally stripped bare of rank. Michelangelo depicts the separation of the blessed and the damned by the saved descending on the left and the damned descending on the right. The fresco is more monochromatic than the ceiling frescoes, perhaps as a result of criticism of his coloring techniques he received in later years, and the work is dominated by the tones of flesh and sky. The recent cleaning and restoration of the fresco, however, revealed a greater chromatic range than previously apparent. Orange, green, yellow, and blue are scattered throughout, animating and unifying the complex scene. The fresco was the subject of a serious dispute between critics of the Catholic Counter-Reformation and those that championed Michelangelo adopted Mannerist style, as exemplified in the painting. The artist was accused of being insensitive to decorum and of flaunting personal style over appropriate depictions of content. A few years after the fresco was completed, the decrees of the Council of Trent urged a tightening up of church control of unusual sacred images. The Pope's own master of ceremonies, Biagio da Cesena, said of the painting, "It was mostly disgraceful that in so sacred a place there should have been depicted all those nude figures, exposing themselves so shamefully, and that it was no work for a papal chapel, but rather for the public baths and taverns. In response, Michelangelo represented Sisena's face as that of Minos, judge of the underworld, in the far bottom right corner of the fresco, giving the king donkey ears to indicate his foolishness, while his nudity is covered by a coiled snake. It is said that when Sisena complained to the Pope, the pontiff joked that his jurisdiction did not extend to hell, so the portrait would have to remain. The genitalia in the fresco, referred to as objectionable, were painted over with drapery after Michelangelo died in 1564 by the Mannerist artist Daniele da Volterra, when the Council of Trent condemned nudity in religious art. Daniele would become famous for this act, earning the humorous nickname Il Braghettone, the breeches maker. Many have identified the face of the man on the flayed skin held by Saint Bartholomew as belonging to the artist himself. In his later years, Michelangelo had become a greatly troubled and introspective person who was concerned about his own spiritual fate. Historians now believe he experienced guilt over his homosexuality, leading many to argue that this is why the artist portrayed himself as a flayed sufferer during the Last Judgment. This feeling of guilt would not leave the inwardly troubled painter, and in a later architectural project he waived all fees for his work on St. Peter's Basilica, wishing to bestow his work as a gift to his beloved church. The fresco was restored along with the Sistine vault between 1980 and 1994 under the supervision of curator of the Vatican Museums, Fabrizio Mancinelli. During the course of the restoration, about half of Daniele's censorship details of fig leaves and breeches were removed. Numerous pieces of buried details, caught under the smoke and grime of centuries, were revealed. Amusingly, it was discovered that the fresco of Biagio de Cesena as Minos with donkey ears was being bitten in the genitalia by a coiled snake. Another interesting discovery was of the figure condemned to hell directly below and to the right of St. Bartholomew with flayed skin, which for centuries had been considered to be male, until the removal of the fig leaf revealed that it was in fact a female. During this period, in which Michelangelo became an official Roman citizen in 1537, he found another close companion in the widow, Vittoria Colonna, the Marquise of Pescara. She too was a poet. Indeed, the majority of Michelangelo poetry is devoted to Colonna, and his adoration of her continued until her death in 1547. He also gifted her paintings and drawings, and one of the most beautiful to have survived is the black chalk drawing Pietà for Vittoria Colonna, 1546. Colonna was the only woman to play a significant part in Michelangelo's life. His mother, we recall, died when he was just a small boy, and their relationship is generally believed to have been platonic. But in 1540, Michelangelo met Cecchino dei Bracci, the 12-year-old son of a wealthy Florentine banker at the court of Pope Paul III. The epitaphs Michelangelo wrote following Cecchino's death 4 years later strongly suggest a sexual relationship. In one, the artist wrote, "Do yet attest for him how gracious I was in bed, when he embraced, and in what the soul doth live." Brutus, completed in 1538. This bust of the Roman patrician Brutus is now housed in the Bargello Museum in Florence. The bust was commissioned by the Republican Donato Gianotti for Cardinal Niccolo Ridolfi in order to celebrate the life of Lorenzino de' Medici, who had earned the name of Brutus by assassinating his distant cousin, Alessandro. During the late period of his career, Michelangelo worked more and more on architectural designs. These included plans for the plaza at the Civic Center at Capitoline Hill with Luigi Vanvitelli, the Church of Santa Maria degli Angeli, construction from 1562, and the Sforza Chapel in the Basilica di Santa Maria Maggiore, 1561-64. But it was for his work on the St. Peter's Basilica that he is best remembered. It was Pope Julius II who proposed demolishing the old basilica and replacing it with what he called the grandest building in Christendom. Although the design by Donato Bramante had been selected in 1505 and foundations laid the following year, little progress had been made since. By the time Michelangelo reluctantly took over the project from his nemesis, Bramante, in 1546, he was in his 70s, stating, "I undertake this only for the love of God and in honor of the Apostle." Michelangelo worked continuously throughout the rest of his life as head architect on the basilica. His most important personal contribution to the project was his work on the design of the dome at the eastern point of the basilica. He dismissed all the ideas of previous architects working on the project except for those of the original designs of Bramante, who, like him, had envisioned a structure to outdo even Brunelleschi's famous dome in Florence. Although the dome was not finished until after his death, the base on which the dome was to be placed was completed, which meant the final version of the dome remains true in essence to Michelangelo's majestic vision. Still the largest church in the world, the dome is both a Roman landmark, rather than just a functional covering for the building's interior, and a testament to Michelangelo's eternal connection to the city.